Hey everyone! Tonight we're exploring the gentle paradox of ancient Babylon's rental systems and their remarkable debt forgiveness ceremonies. Before we settle in, take a moment to like this if you enjoy these deep historical explorations. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always find it fascinating how our global community gathers to explore these complex questions together. Now get comfortable, dim those lights. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic events or heroic tales. Instead, we're going to examine something much quieter but equally important: the sophisticated economic wisdom that allowed one of history's greatest civilizations to balance individual accumulation with social renewal. Let's begin our gentle journey into the heart of Mesopotamian economic innovation. Picture, if you will, the soft dawn light breaking over ancient Babylon, illuminating the great ziggurat of Marduk as merchants prepare for another day of careful negotiations. In temple courtyards and bustling marketplaces, the sound of stylus on clay creates a gentle rhythm as scribes record agreements that will bind families for generations. Yet within this same system lies a profound contradiction. These permanent-seeming contracts existed alongside periodic ceremonies that would erase debts entirely, restoring social equilibrium through what the Babylonians called anduraru, meaning freedom or release. Tonight, we'll explore how this ancient civilization developed rental systems of remarkable sophistication, from simple agricultural leases to complex urban arrangements, while simultaneously maintaining the wisdom to periodically reset their entire economic order. We'll discover how temple administrators balanced profit with social obligation, how families navigated multi-generational rental agreements, and how kings used debt forgiveness as both economic policy and sacred ritual. This is a story of human ingenuity meeting timeless challenges, the eternal tension between individual prosperity and collective stability, played out in the clay tablets and ceremonial courtyards of humanity's first great commercial civilization. In the gentle pre-dawn hours along the banks of the Euphrates, when the great ziggurat of Marduk cast its shadow across the awakening city of Babylon, scribes would already be at their work, their reed styluses moving with practiced precision across fresh clay tablets. The soft scratching sounds of cuneiform emerging from wet earth created a rhythm as ancient and enduring as the river itself, recording agreements that would bind families, shape communities, and reflect the profound economic wisdom of a civilization that understood both the necessity of structure and the healing power of renewal. The Babylonian approach to rental systems emerged not from a single moment of innovation, but from centuries of gradual refinement, building upon the agricultural foundations laid by their Sumerian predecessors. In the early temple estates of Ur and Uruk, simple arrangements between temple administrators and farmers had evolved into something far more sophisticated by the time Hammurabi's scribes were codifying the Great Law Code around 1750 BCE. These rental relationships represented more than mere economic transactions. They embodied a complex understanding of how human societies could balance individual ambition with collective stability, personal accumulation with social renewal. The temples themselves served as the first great landlords, their vast holdings stretching across the fertile alluvium between the rivers. Temple administrators, often drawn from families who had served in these roles for generations, developed an intimate understanding of both the practical necessities of agricultural management and the deeper rhythms that governed human economic behavior. They observed how debt could accumulate like silt in an irrigation channel, gradually choking the flow of prosperity until periodic clearing became essential for the health of the entire system. As Babylon grew from a modest city-state into the dominant power of Mesopotamia, its rental systems evolved to accommodate not just agricultural land, but urban workshops, residential quarters, and commercial spaces within the bustling heart of the ancient world's greatest trading center. The standardized terminology that emerged during this period reflects a sophisticated understanding of different types of rental relationships, each with its own seasonal rhythms, payment schedules, and social obligations. Agricultural leases followed the ancient calendar of flood and harvest, while urban rentals adapted to the more complex rhythms of craft production and international trade. The scribes who crafted these agreements were not merely recording legal formalities, but participating in the creation of social bonds that could span generations. A rental contract for a field outside Babylon might specify not only the annual payment in barley or silver, but also the tenant's obligations to maintain irrigation channels, participate in communal labor projects, and honor the religious festivals that marked the agricultural year. These agreements recognized that economic relationships existed within a web of social, religious, and environmental connections that required careful attention and periodic renewal. The paradox at the heart of Babylonian economic life became apparent in the tension between these increasingly sophisticated rental systems and the periodic debt forgiveness ceremonies that would sweep away accumulated obligations, like the annual floods, that renewed the fertility of the land. Temple administrators who spent years perfecting rental agreements that could account for every contingency also participated in ceremonies that would ceremonially destroy the very tablets they had so carefully prepared. This apparent contradiction reflected a profound understanding that economic systems, like the natural world they emerged from, required both structure and renewal, both accumulation and release. The wisdom embedded in these ancient practices speaks to us across millennia, with particular relevance as we contemplate our own economic relationships and their social consequences. The Babylonian approach suggests that the most sustainable economic systems are those that acknowledge both human nature's drive toward accumulation and the social necessity of periodic renewal, creating institutions that can accommodate both individual ambition and collective well-being within a framework of patient, cyclical wisdom. The gentle art of crafting rental agreements in ancient Babylon reveals itself through the patient work of scribes who understood that words, once pressed into clay, would bind generations in relationships of mutual obligation. These documents, discovered in countless archaeological excavations across Mesopotamia, speak to us across millennia with their careful attention to detail and their profound understanding of human nature's complexities. The architecture of these agreements followed patterns that had evolved slowly over centuries, beginning with the simple agricultural leases of the Sumerian period and developing into sophisticated instruments that could accommodate the intricate needs of urban commercial life. A typical rental contract would begin with the invocation of divine witnesses, acknowledging that these earthly arrangements existed within a cosmic order that demanded justice and fairness. The gods Shamash and Marduk were frequently called upon to oversee these transactions, their presence lending both solemnity and protection to the agreements. The physical preparation of these contracts was itself a meditative process. Scribes would select clay of the proper consistency, working it with their hands until it achieved the perfect texture for receiving the precise impressions of their reed styluses. The workshops where these documents were created were quiet places of concentration, where the soft sounds of clay being shaped and the gentle scratching of writing implements created a rhythmic backdrop to the serious business of recording human commitments. Agricultural rental agreements formed the foundation of this system, their terms carefully calibrated to the rhythms of the Mesopotamian seasons. A field rental might specify that the tenant would receive the land after the spring flooding had receded, with the first payment due at the barley harvest and subsequent payments following the wheat harvest and the date palm gathering. The contracts would detail not only the rental fee, typically paid in grain or silver, but also the tenant's obligations to maintain irrigation channels, repair field boundaries, and preserve the fertility of the soil through proper fallowing practices. The language of these agreements reveals a sophisticated understanding of agricultural realities. Clauses would account for the possibility of flood damage, specifying how rental payments might be adjusted if the Tigris or Euphrates rose beyond normal levels. Other provisions address the risk of drought, establishing reduced payment schedules if the rains failed to arrive at their appointed times. These contracts demonstrate an awareness that human plans must always accommodate the larger forces of nature and divine will. Urban rental agreements developed their own distinctive characteristics as Babylon grew into a major commercial center. Workshop rentals would specify not only the rental fee, but also the tenant's right to use certain tools and equipment that remained the property of the landlord. These arrangements often included provisions for the rental of specialized equipment such as potter's wheels, weaving looms, or metalworking anvils, creating complex relationships where the boundaries between landlord and business partner became delicately blurred. Residential rental agreements in the city reflected the growing complexity of urban life. A house rental might include specific rooms or sections of a building with careful attention to shared spaces such as courtyards, wells, and storage areas. The contracts would detail the tenant's responsibilities for maintaining the property, including the crucial task of keeping the flat roof properly sealed against the seasonal rains. These agreements often included provisions for subletting, recognizing that urban dwellers might need to share their spaces with extended family members or business associates. The role of witnesses in these agreements cannot be understated. Each contract would typically include the names of several witnesses, often including neighbors, family members, and respected community figures. These witnesses were not merely passive observers, but active participants in the creation of binding social relationships. Their presence at the contract ceremony and their names pressed into the clay tablet meant that they accepted responsibility for ensuring that the agreement would be honored by all parties. The sealing of rental agreements was a ceremony that combined practical necessity with symbolic meaning. The landlord and tenant would each press their personal seals into the soft clay, creating unique impressions that served as ancient signatures. These seals, often carved with intricate designs depicting gods, animals, or geometric patterns, were treasured possessions that carried deep personal and family significance. The act of sealing represented not just legal commitment, but also the placing of one's personal honor and reputation behind the agreement. Storage and preservation of these contracts required careful attention to their physical needs. Temple and palace archives developed sophisticated systems for organizing and protecting these documents, understanding that they represented the economic foundation of their communities. The tablets were often stored in specially designed containers, protected from moisture, and arranged according to systems that allowed scribes to locate specific agreements when disputes arose or when rental periods expired. The evolution of rental terminology reveals the growing sophistication of Babylonian economic thought. Early contracts used simple Sumerian terms for basic concepts of land use and payment, but over time, a rich vocabulary developed to describe increasingly complex arrangements. Terms emerged to distinguish between different types of rental payments, various categories of property maintenance obligations, and subtle distinctions in the rights and responsibilities of different parties to the agreements. These documents also reveal the integration of rental systems with broader social and religious observances. Many contracts would specify that certain payments were due during particular religious festivals, linking economic obligations to the community's spiritual calendar. This integration meant that rental relationships were not merely commercial transactions, but participated in the larger rhythms of social and religious life that gave meaning and structure to Babylonian society. The careful preservation of these agreements in family and institutional archives demonstrates their enduring importance in Babylonian society. Generations of scribes would copy and recopying important contracts, ensuring that the terms of crucial agreements would survive, even if the original tablets were damaged or lost. This practice of preservation reveals a deep understanding that these economic relationships formed the foundation of social stability and that their careful documentation was essential for maintaining the trust and cooperation upon which their civilization depended. The fundamental tension between individual wealth accumulation and social stability formed the beating heart of Babylonian economic philosophy, a paradox that ancient administrators contemplated with the same quiet intensity that modern economists bring to questions of inequality and social cohesion. In the gentle morning light that filtered through the high windows of temple archives, scribes would pause in their careful record-keeping to consider how the very systems they documented with such precision contained within them the seeds of their own periodic dissolution. The accumulation of wealth through rental income and debt relationships followed patterns as predictable as the seasonal flooding of the Euphrates. Successful landlords, whether temple institutions or private individuals, would gradually expand their holdings, acquiring additional properties as struggling tenants defaulted on their obligations. The mathematical precision of compound interest, already well understood by Babylonian mathematicians, meant that even modest debts could grow into insurmountable burdens within a generation. A farmer who borrowed barley seed during a difficult harvest might find his children working the same land not as owners, but as perpetual tenants, their labor serving to pay interest on debts that seemed to multiply like grain in a fertile field. Yet the ancient Mesopotamians possessed a sophisticated understanding of economic cycles that transcended mere mathematical calculation. They recognized that excessive concentration of wealth and property in the hands of a few individuals or institutions created social instability that ultimately threatened the very foundations of economic prosperity. The wisdom embedded in their approach reflected centuries of observation, passed down through generations of administrators who had witnessed the consequences of unchecked accumulation. The concept of periodic renewal emerged from this understanding, embodying a profound recognition that economic systems, like agricultural fields, required periods of rest and restoration to maintain their long-term productivity. The Babylonian term anduraru, meaning freedom or release, carried connotations that extended far beyond mere debt forgiveness. It represented a return to an original state of balance, a restoration of the social equilibrium that excessive debt accumulation had disturbed. Royal proclamations of debt forgiveness were not arbitrary acts of royal generosity, but carefully timed interventions based on observable signs of economic distress. palace administrators maintained detailed records of debt levels throughout the kingdom, monitoring the proportion of agricultural land that had passed from independent farmers to creditors. When these proportions reached critical thresholds, when too many families had lost their ancestral holdings to debt, the wisdom of renewal would be invoked. The practical implementation of these forgiveness ceremonies revealed the sophisticated administrative capabilities of Babylonian bureaucracy. Scribes would spend months preparing for an Anduraru proclamation, identifying which debts would be forgiven and which contractual obligations would be restored to their original terms. The process required careful distinction between different types of debt. Commercial loans between merchants might be excluded from forgiveness, while agricultural debts that threatened family landholdings would be completely erased. The emotional landscape of these periodic renewals was complex and nuanced. Creditors who had accumulated substantial rental properties through debt collection faced the prospect of losing their investments, yet they also benefited from the social stability that debt forgiveness created. A kingdom where too many families had lost their land to debt was a kingdom vulnerable to social unrest, military weakness, and economic stagnation. The wealthy landlords who lost property in one forgiveness cycle often found themselves better positioned to prosper in the renewed economic environment that followed. For debtors, the approach of an Anduraru ceremony brought a mixture of hope and anxiety. Families who had labored for years under the burden of inherited debt could scarcely believe that their obligations might be simply erased. Yet the disruption of established relationships, even oppressive ones, created its own uncertainties. A tenant farmer who had worked the same land for decades might find himself suddenly responsible for managing property he had not owned since childhood. The timing of debt forgiveness ceremonies reflected deep integration with religious and seasonal cycles. Many Anduraru proclamations coincided with coronation ceremonies, linking the renewal of royal authority with the renewal of economic relationships. Others were timed to coincide with major religious festivals, particularly those associated with agricultural cycles and the renewal of natural fertility. This integration suggested that Babylonian thinkers understood economic relationships as part of a larger cosmic order that required periodic restoration and renewal. The philosophical implications of these practices extended beyond mere economic policy into fundamental questions about the nature of property, obligation, and social responsibility. The willingness to periodically erase debts and restore property to its original owners reflected a conception of wealth as ultimately belonging to the community rather than to individuals. Private accumulation was permitted and even encouraged, but it was understood to exist within a larger framework of social obligation and collective welfare. This ancient wisdom offers profound insights for contemporary economic thinking, suggesting that the tension between individual accumulation and social stability is not a modern invention, but a fundamental challenge that human societies have grappled with for millennia. The Babylonian solution of periodic renewal provides not a direct model for modern policy, but a framework for thinking about how economic systems might be designed to serve both individual ambition and collective flourishing. The Anduraru ceremonies represented perhaps the most profound expression of Mesopotamian economic wisdom, transforming the abstract concept of debt forgiveness into tangible rituals that renewed the social fabric of Babylonian society. These ceremonies, whose very name derives from the Akkadian word meaning freedom or release, created sacred spaces where the accumulated tensions of economic life could be ceremonially dissolved, allowing communities to begin anew with restored equilibrium. The preparation for these ceremonies began months in advance, as royal scribes meticulously compiled lists of debts to be forgiven throughout the kingdom. In the quiet chambers of palace archives, administrators worked by lamplight, their styluses moving across fresh clay tablets as they documented which obligations would be erased and which would remain. The process required extraordinary attention to detail, for the ceremonies distinguished between different types of debt. Commercial loans between merchants typically remained intact, while agricultural debts and those arising from personal hardship faced complete forgiveness. As word of an approaching Anduraru spread through the kingdom, a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety settled over Babylonian communities. In the workshops of metalworkers and the homes of textile producers, families gathered to discuss what the ceremony might mean for their accumulated obligations. Some had labored for years under the weight of debts incurred during failed harvests or family emergencies, while others had gradually built modest prosperity through careful management of their rental agreements and small loans to neighbors. The ceremonies themselves unfolded with deliberate solemnity, beginning in the great temple courtyards, where the community gathered to witness the royal proclamation. The king, draped in ceremonial robes and accompanied by high priests, would read aloud the terms of forgiveness, while scribes held aloft the tablets containing the debts to be erased. The moment of actual forgiveness carried profound symbolic weight. Debt tablets were ceremonially broken or dissolved in water, their cuneiform inscriptions disappearing as the clay returned to its original, unmarked state. Yet the Anduraru ceremonies revealed the sophisticated understanding that debt forgiveness alone could not address the underlying social tensions that had necessitated such dramatic intervention. The rituals included provisions for the restoration of family lands that had been lost to creditors, the return of family members who had entered debt slavery, and the re-establishment of traditional social relationships that had been disrupted by economic hardship. These elements transformed the ceremonies from simple debt cancellation into comprehensive social renewal. The timing of these ceremonies reflected deep wisdom about economic cycles and human psychology. Most Anduraru proclamations coincided with royal accessions, linking the forgiveness of debts to the establishment of new political legitimacy. This connection was not merely opportunistic. It recognized that periods of political transition created natural opportunities for social renewal, moments when established patterns could be questioned and reformed without threatening the fundamental stability of the kingdom. The practical implementation of debt forgiveness required careful coordination between religious, administrative, and judicial authorities. Temple priests, who often served as witnesses to the original debt agreements, played crucial roles in verifying which obligations fell under the forgiveness provisions. Local administrators traveled throughout their districts, ensuring that the royal proclamations were properly understood and implemented. Judges prepared to handle the inevitable disputes that arose when the precise terms of forgiveness were applied to specific situations. The ceremonies also revealed the profound integration of economic policy with religious understanding in Babylonian society. The Anduraru was not merely a practical response to economic crisis. It was understood as a restoration of cosmic order, a return to the divine principles of justice that governed both human society and the natural world. This religious dimension gave the ceremonies their power to transform not just economic relationships, but the entire social atmosphere of the kingdom. The emotional impact of these ceremonies on ordinary Babylonians can be glimpsed in the careful preservation of proclamation texts and the archaeological evidence of deliberately destroyed debt tablets. For families who had struggled under the weight of accumulated obligations. The moment of forgiveness must have felt like a genuine rebirth, a chance to rebuild their lives without the crushing burden of impossible debts. Yet the ceremonies also created complex feelings among creditors who watched their carefully accumulated assets disappear in the service of broader social harmony. The wisdom embedded in the Aru tradition extended beyond immediate debt relief to encompass a sophisticated understanding of economic sustainability. The periodic nature of these ceremonies created predictable cycles of renewal that prevented the excessive accumulation of debt from permanently destabilizing society. This cyclical approach recognized that economic systems, like natural ecosystems, required periodic disturbance to maintain their long-term health and vitality. The intricate web of relationships that emerged from Babylonian rental and debt systems created a social ecology as complex and interdependent as the irrigation networks that sustained their civilization. Within this carefully balanced ecosystem, families, communities, and institutions found themselves bound together by threads of obligation and opportunity that stretched across generations, creating patterns of social organization that would influence human societies for millennia to come. In the quiet courtyards of Babylonian homes, where clay tablets were stored in carefully organized archives, we can observe how rental agreements and debt obligations shaped the very structure of family life. The extended household, already a fundamental unit of Mesopotamian society, became something more complex under the influence of these economic relationships. A single family might simultaneously serve as landlords to some, tenants to others, creditors in certain transactions, and debtors in still others. This multifaceted economic identity created a social fabric of remarkable resilience and adaptability. Consider the household of Murashu, a family whose extensive business archive from 5th century Nippur reveals the sophisticated ways in which rental and debt relationships intertwined with kinship obligations. 3 generations of this family managed agricultural estates, urban properties, and commercial ventures, with each member playing specific roles in maintaining the complex network of relationships that sustained their economic activities. The eldest son might negotiate new rental agreements, while his brothers supervised existing properties, and their wives managed the household finances that made these ventures possible. Children learned not merely the mechanics of economic transactions, but the subtle art of maintaining relationships that could span decades. The social stratification that these systems both reinforced and occasionally challenged reveals the nuanced understanding that Babylonian society had developed regarding wealth, status, and social mobility. Unlike rigid caste systems, the rental and debt relationships created a more fluid hierarchy where economic success could translate into social advancement, yet where periodic debt forgiveness ceremonies ensured that no family fell permanently into destitution. This delicate balance required constant negotiation and adjustment, creating a society that was simultaneously stable and dynamic. Women occupied particularly complex positions within this social ecology. While legal documents often recorded male names as the primary parties to rental agreements, extensive evidence suggests that women frequently managed these relationships in practice. The wife of a landlord might collect rents, negotiate renewals, and maintain the social connections that made business relationships possible. Widows often inherited not just property, but entire networks of rental relationships, becoming significant economic actors in their own right. The archive of Itimad-Duk Balatu from Neo-Babylonian Babylon includes numerous examples of women conducting complex property transactions, their economic activities seamlessly integrated with their social roles as mothers, wives, and community members. The rhythms of social life adapted themselves to the cycles of rental and debt relationships. Seasonal rent payments coincided with harvest festivals, creating community celebrations that reinforced social bonds while fulfilling economic obligations. The approach of debt forgiveness ceremonies brought families together to discuss which obligations might be forgiven and which relationships might be renewed on different terms. These gatherings served multiple functions simultaneously. They were practical planning sessions, social reunions, and ritual observances that connected economic life with the deeper patterns of cosmic order. Children growing up in this environment absorbed lessons that extended far beyond simple arithmetic or contract law. They learned to read the subtle signs of economic stress in their community, to understand when a neighbor's request for extended payment terms reflected temporary difficulty rather than permanent inability to pay. They observed how their elders balanced the pursuit of profit with the maintenance of social relationships, how business success required not just shrewd calculation, but genuine care for the welfare of partners and clients. These lessons in economic empathy would serve them throughout their lives, whether they became merchants, farmers, or administrators. The professional classes that emerged to manage these complex systems created their own social networks and cultural traditions. Scribes who specialized in rental law formed informal guilds that preserved technical knowledge while also maintaining the ethical standards that made the system trustworthy. Master scribes took pride in training apprentices who could draft agreements that protected all parties while anticipating potential disputes. These professionals served as bridges between different social classes, their expertise making complex economic relationships accessible to farmers and artisans who might otherwise have been excluded from sophisticated commercial activities. Community leaders found themselves navigating the delicate balance between individual economic freedom and collective social stability. Village elders mediated disputes between landlords and tenants, helping to preserve relationships that might otherwise have been severed by disagreement. They also served as informal advisors to families facing difficult economic decisions, their accumulated wisdom helping to prevent the kind of debt accumulation that could destabilize entire communities. Their role required not just knowledge of law and custom, but deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics. The periodic debt forgiveness ceremonies created particularly complex social dynamics as they temporarily inverted normal economic relationships while ultimately strengthening the social fabric. Creditors who had spent years building wealth through careful lending suddenly found their assets reduced, yet they also experienced the social benefits of participating in community renewal. Debtors received not just economic relief, but restoration of social standing, their gratitude creating new forms of obligation and loyalty. These ceremonies required careful management to ensure that they strengthened rather than undermined the social relationships that made economic life possible. The ancient Mesopotamian understanding of economic cycles emerged not from abstract theorizing, but from millennia of careful observation, as patient as the scribes who recorded the subtle rhythms of prosperity and hardship across generations. In the quiet archives of Babylon's temples, where clay tablets accumulated like sedimentary layers of human experience, administrators developed a sophisticated awareness of how economic forces moved through time with the same predictable patterns as the seasonal floods that nourished their fields. The Babylonian conception of economic cycles was deeply intertwined with their understanding of natural rhythms. Just as the Tigris and Euphrates followed predictable patterns of flood and recession, so too did the accumulation of debt and the concentration of wealth follow observable cycles that wise administrators learned to anticipate. The economic year began with the spring floods, when agricultural leases were renewed and the potential for prosperity was highest. Yet experienced observers knew that within this cycle of renewal lay the seeds of future imbalance, as successful harvests led to expansion of credit, which in turn created the conditions for eventual debt accumulation. Temple records from Sippar and Babylon reveal how carefully administrators tracked these patterns. Scribes noted not only the immediate details of rental agreements and debt obligations, but also the broader trends that emerged over decades. They observed how periods of abundant harvests led to increased lending, as landowners sought to expand their holdings and merchants extended credit to fund new ventures. These expansions created prosperity, but they also concentrated wealth in fewer hands and increased the debt burden on farmers and artisans who had borrowed against future harvests. The wisdom embedded in periodic debt forgiveness ceremonies reflected this deep understanding of economic cycles. Rather than viewing debt accumulation as a moral failing or economic inefficiency, Babylonian administrators recognized it as a natural consequence of successful economic activity. The very mechanisms that enabled prosperity, credit systems, rental arrangements, and investment in agricultural expansion inevitably led to periodic imbalances that threatened social stability. The Andararu ceremonies represented not emergency interventions, but planned responses to predictable cycles. This cyclical understanding extended beyond purely economic considerations to encompass the relationship between human nature and economic systems. Babylonian administrators recognized that individual accumulation, while necessary for economic growth, created social tensions that required periodic resolution. The cuneiform texts reveal a sophisticated appreciation for how economic relationships affected family structures, community bonds, and social hierarchies. They understood that allowing debt accumulation to continue indefinitely would eventually undermine the very social fabric that made economic activity possible. The integration of economic cycles with religious and philosophical traditions provided a framework for understanding these patterns as part of a larger cosmic order. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, described the universe as emerging from the resolution of primordial conflicts, and this theme of cyclical renewal through periodic resolution permeated their approach to economic management. The timing of debt forgiveness ceremonies often coincided with religious festivals celebrating renewal and rebirth, reinforcing the connection between economic policy and spiritual understanding. Archaeological evidence from Neo-Babylonian archives demonstrates how this cyclical thinking influenced practical decision-making. Rental contracts from the 6th century BCE show administrators adjusting lease terms based on their assessment of where the current economic cycle was heading. During periods of expansion, they negotiated longer-term agreements with more favorable terms for tenants, recognizing that debt accumulation was likely to accelerate. Conversely, during periods following debt forgiveness, they structured agreements to take advantage of the temporary reduction in debt burdens. The sophistication of this economic thinking becomes apparent when examining how Babylonian administrators balanced competing interests within their cyclical framework. They recognized that debt forgiveness, while necessary for social stability, also created moral hazard by reducing incentives for careful financial management. Their solution was to implement forgiveness selectively, targeting specific types of debt while maintaining other obligations. This nuanced approach reflected their understanding that economic cycles required management rather than simple mechanical responses. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural activity provided the temporal framework for understanding these longer economic cycles. Just as farmers learned to read the subtle signs that indicated optimal planting times, economic administrators developed sensitivity to the indicators that suggested approaching imbalance. Rising numbers of debt contracts, increasing concentration of land ownership, and growing numbers of debt slaves all served as early warning signals that guided the timing of interventions. This cyclical wisdom extended to understanding how different sectors of the economy moved through phases of expansion and contraction. Temple records show administrators tracking not only agricultural cycles, but also patterns in craft production, trade activity, and urban development. They recognized that economic cycles affected different groups differently, with farmers experiencing seasonal variations, while merchants and artisans faced longer-term fluctuations based on trade patterns and urban growth. The patient accumulation of this economic wisdom across generations created a remarkable institutional memory that guided policy decisions. Unlike modern economic systems that often treat each crisis as unprecedented, Babylonian administrators operated within a framework that expected periodic imbalances and had developed tested mechanisms for addressing them. This long-term perspective allowed them to maintain economic stability across centuries of political change and external pressures. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the scribal school attached to the Temple of Marduk, illuminating rows of young apprentices bent over their practice tablets. Their styluses moved with careful precision, tracing the complex cuneiform signs that would make them masters of Babylon's intricate economic systems. The gentle scratch of reed against clay created a rhythm as old as civilization itself, a sound that had echoed through these halls for generations, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of administrative practice. In the corner of the room, Master Nabu Ahi-Idin observed his students with the patient attention of one who understood that true expertise came not from memorizing formulas, but from grasping the deeper patterns that governed human economic relationships. Today's lesson focused on the subtle art of rental contract modification, a skill that required not only legal knowledge, but an intuitive understanding of seasonal rhythms, family dynamics, and the delicate balance between individual needs and community stability. The students worked with copies of actual contracts from the temple archives, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands. Each tablet told a story of careful negotiation, of families seeking security through the complex web of rental relationships that sustained Babylonian society. As the apprentices traced the familiar phrases that governed field rentals, workshop leases, and urban property agreements, they absorbed not merely legal terminology, but the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to navigate the eternal tension between stability and change. The administrative machinery that supported these systems extended far beyond the scribal schools. In the great archive chambers beneath the temple, professional keepers maintained vast collections of contracts, their surfaces carefully cleaned and organized according to principles developed over centuries of practice. These men moved through their domains with the quiet confidence of those who understood that their work preserved not merely individual agreements, but the institutional memory of an entire civilization. The archive keeper, Bel Ushazib, had spent 40 years perfecting the art of document preservation, his hands gentle as he handled tablets that recorded the economic lives of families stretching back generations. He understood that each contract existed within a web of relationships that extended far beyond the immediate parties, connecting landlords and tenants, creditors and debtors in patterns that reflected the deeper rhythms of Babylonian society. His work required not only technical skill, but a philosophical understanding of how human relationships evolved over time, how the needs of one generation influenced the possibilities available to the next. The practical challenges of managing these complex systems required constant adaptation and innovation. Local administrators throughout the Babylonian territories developed their own approaches to implementing central policies, their methods shaped by regional conditions and local customs. In the agricultural districts along the Euphrates, administrators learned to coordinate rental agreements with the seasonal flooding that determined planting schedules. In the commercial centers, they developed specialized procedures for managing the complex leases that governed workshop spaces and storage facilities. The judge Shamash Shum Ukin had presided over rental disputes for 20 years, his reputation built on a deep understanding of both legal precedent and human nature. He approached each case with the patience of one who recognized that behind every contract lay a family's hopes and fears, their attempts to secure prosperity while navigating the uncertainties of economic life. His judgments reflected not merely legal expertise, but a wisdom that came from years of observing how economic relationships shaped and were shaped by the deeper currents of human experience. The enforcement of these systems required a delicate balance between authority and flexibility. Administrative officials learned to distinguish between disputes that arose from genuine misunderstanding and those that reflected deeper social tensions. They developed procedures that allowed for mediation and compromise, recognizing that the preservation of long-term relationships often mattered more than strict adherence to contractual terms. This approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of how economic systems functioned, not as mechanical arrangements, but as living expressions of human community. The training of administrators involved not only technical instruction, but a kind of philosophical education that prepared them to understand the deeper purposes their work served. Young officials learned to see beyond individual transactions to the larger patterns that connected economic activity with social stability, seasonal cycles with human prosperity, individual accumulation with collective welfare. This education took place not in formal classrooms, but through years of apprenticeship under experienced administrators who understood that true expertise came from patient observation of how economic systems actually functioned in practice. The daily routines of these administrators reflected a deep appreciation for the complexity of their task. They began each day with careful review of pending cases. Their attention focused not merely on legal technicalities, but on the human circumstances that gave meaning to each agreement. They understood that their work contributed to a larger project of social organization that had been developing for centuries, each generation building upon the wisdom of those who came before, while adapting to the changing conditions of their own time. As evening approached and the scribes prepared to close their tablets for the day, the quiet satisfaction of work well done settled over the administrative centers of Babylon. The systems they maintained would continue to function through the night, their influence extending into countless homes where families planned their futures within the framework of rental agreements and debt relationships that connected them to the larger community. In this peaceful rhythm of daily administration, the practical wisdom of an ancient civilization continued its patient work of balancing individual needs with collective stability, demonstrating that the most profound innovations often emerged not from dramatic gestures, but from the quiet persistence of human institutions carefully tended across generations. As evening light settles across the ancient plains, Where Babylon once flourished, we find ourselves at the gentle conclusion of our contemplative journey through the sophisticated economic wisdom of these remarkable people. The rental systems and debt forgiveness ceremonies we have explored together reveal something profound about human nature itself, the eternal dance between individual aspiration and collective harmony, between the accumulation of security and the wisdom of periodic renewal. In the quiet spaces between the clay tablets and royal proclamations, we discover that the Babylonians understood something essential about economic life that transcends time. Their rental agreements, carefully crafted with seasonal rhythms and human relationships in mind, speak to our deepest need for both stability and flexibility. The Anduraru ceremonies, with their ceremonial breaking of debt tablets, remind us that even the most sophisticated systems require moments of grace, of starting anew. Picture now the gentle twilight settling over the Mesopotamian landscape, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow as they have for millennia, carrying with them the patient wisdom of countless generations. In this peaceful scene, we can almost hear the soft conversations of families gathering after the day's work, their economic relationships woven into the larger tapestry of community life. The scribes have set aside their styluses, the administrators have closed their archives, and the gentle rhythms of daily life continue their eternal patterns. The profound sophistication of these ancient systems, the careful balance between individual prosperity and social stability, the integration of practical management with deeper wisdom, the understanding that economic relationships are fundamentally human relationships, all of this speaks to us across the centuries with remarkable relevance. In their patient observation of cycles, their willingness to periodically reset accumulated imbalances, their recognition that economic justice requires both individual responsibility and collective compassion, we find insights that remain as valuable today as they were 4,000 years ago. As we allow this contemplation to settle into our consciousness, we might imagine ourselves as peaceful observers in that ancient world, watching the gentle preparations for an Anduraru ceremony. The tablets being carefully gathered, the solemn yet hopeful faces of families whose burdens are about to be lifted, the quiet wisdom of rulers who understood that true strength comes not from rigid accumulation, but from the flexibility to begin again. In this scene, we find not drama, but profound peace, the peace that comes from systems designed with human flourishing in mind. Let your breathing slow now, matching the patient rhythms of those ancient rivers, flowing steadily toward their eternal destination. Feel the weight of accumulated tensions beginning to dissolve, just as those debt tablets were dissolved in the ceremonial waters of forgiveness. Allow the wisdom of these ancient people to settle into your awareness, like evening mist settling over fertile fields, gentle, nourishing, bringing the promise of renewal. In this peaceful state, we can appreciate how the Babylonians created something beautiful, economic systems that honored both human ambition and human limitation, that provided structure while preserving the possibility of grace. Their rental agreements were not merely legal documents, but expressions of trust between human beings. Their debt forgiveness ceremonies were not merely economic policies, but recognitions of our shared humanity. As sleep approaches like the gentle dawn that once broke over the ziggurat of Marduk, carrying with it the promise of another day's patient work and quiet wisdom, allow yourself to rest in the profound peace that comes from understanding. The ancient Babylonians, with their clay tablets and careful ceremonies, Their rental systems and debt forgiveness rituals offer us something more valuable than historical knowledge. They offer us the gift of perspective, the recognition that human economic relationships, at their best, reflect our deepest values of justice, compassion, and hope. Rest now in this understanding, letting the gentle wisdom of these ancient people carry you into peaceful sleep, where the eternal rhythms of human community continue their quiet work of renewal and grace.